Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome back, listeners. Liz Lang here with Dr. Mark Burton. This week, we are going to talk about marriage advice, or as we said last week, the longer version, characteristics of long-term effective relationships, which is kind of a mouthful. But we thought it would be good to just kind of talk about what makes a marriage work, what's effective in marriage. It's Dr. Burton's favorite topic, and it's a topic I enjoy as well. And probably my favorite topic because I feel like I have a pretty fantastic marriage. I feel like I have a really good marriage, and I feel like my marriage is successful. And so I enjoy talking about my marriage because it brings me incredible happiness. And I think it's something we're good at, Curtis and I. I think we're good at being married.
So, maybe you and I are a good team to talk about this. I feel like I have a great marriage, been married 40, almost 45 years. And, I was thinking about this topic. I think who you choose to be married to is probably the most important decision you ever make in life.
I agree.
It sets in motion so many different things, because often kids come as a result of that, but just happiness in general. So I think it is a very important choice that you make. And there are a couple of books I'll reference. I'll just give those the start now. And I've probably talked about him before. John Gottman, who really is famous for being a marriage researcher. And for 40 years, probably that's what he's done is he's looked at what are the differences between successful marriages and those marriages that are not successful. And I believe his first book, it's called The 7 Principles for Making Marriage Work. Now, some of the ideas that we're going to talk about tonight come from there. But I think that is a book that is great for any couple. And I suggest to the couples that I see, often they read it together out loud. And one of the nice things about that book is every chapter has exercises that you can do together. And so tonight, when I talk about, maybe an idea that comes from there, I'll just let the listeners know. So that's a good book. The other one that I've mentioned before, I think on here is Robin Smith is the author, and it's called Lies at the Altar. And I think that's a really great book for people maybe contemplating marriage to look at. And my favorite section is I think it's 276 questions to ask before you get married. So I think that this is a great topic. It's the thing that really, when I was back in graduate school so many years ago, I really wanted to do marriage work. I don't know why I wanted that. It was just always an interest. And that's the way it's been for most of my career. The vast majority of my work has been with couples. So what now that you decided to get married? What do you do? I think that I've mentioned before, I always look at two people coming together as they're bringing little mini cultures. So if you look at yourself and Curtis, and you look at your families of origin, they're probably pretty different. I mean, there are similarities.
Oh, yeah.
But they're probably different.
They're very different.
For instance, how we celebrate holidays, how we celebrate birthdays, what do we do on vacation, things like that. And we tend to come into the marriage thinking, oh, the way we did it in my family growing up is the right way. And you have to really think of it as bringing together two mini cultures and creating a brand new culture. And so I think if you approach it that way, which is going to be one of the points down here that I talk about that I think is important, is that your way is not always the right way.
Right. And I think parents who have children who are getting married need to recognize that as well. I think it can be hard for them to see, well, this is my child and they're still my child, but they're also married. I think it can be hard for parents to let go of ownership of that relationship.
Oh, I agree. And that's actually a whole different topic in how do you set boundaries with your parents when you're married, which would be a good topic to do one day. So you're right. Often it's the parents of the young people getting married who have the hardest time. So as far as top characteristics, now, as I mentioned before we started recording, these are my top characteristics today.
Okay.
If we talk next week, there'd probably be a different list, or some of them would be the same. And these are in no particular order of importance. So the first one is compassion and empathy.
Okay.
And I think that Harville Hendricks, who also wrote a book I like called Getting the Love You Want, he always said one of the primary tasks of marriage is to learn to be comfortable with difference. So it kind of goes back to what I said about these two mini cultures, is that you don't marry yourself, you actually marry someone else.
Yes.
And so I think the compassion and the empathy is that you are with someone who does not think exactly the same way you do. I often get couples, they'll come in and they'll say, we are so different. How is this going to work? And I remind them that that is true for every single couple that I see, for every single couple that gets married. You are different people. You aren't the same. So learning to accept differences with compassion and empathy, I think, is a really important characteristic. So the next one, communication. It's under the heading of communication, but I think the most important part of communication is listening.
Learn to be a good listener.
You've got to be a great listener to understand. And so that I think that really ties in with the compassion and the empathy piece, because you have to listen with empathy and compassion.
And try to genuinely understand where the other person is coming from.
That's it.
Not just listening because it's what I have to do, but really try to see it from their perspective.
I had listed this next one as a separate, but I think it goes with this. It's being non-judgmental. I think when you're listening to someone, if you feel like you're being judged, you're going to clamp, or the person who's talking isn't going to be that willing to talk about those things that are intensely personal. I had this situation just today with a couple that if you want the other person to really open up and talk, you have to create a safe environment in which that can happen. And so that safe environment includes listening well, compassion, empathy, and not being judgmental about what you're hearing. And you said a really important thing a few minutes ago. It's about understanding, listening with understanding. So here's another characteristic that in my mind goes along with understanding. This is probably the first time you might have heard this in this type of list. Curiosity.
Yes, I see exactly where you're going with this. Yeah.
So I see this often in couples. They just aren't that curious about their partner. And I think that if you're going to listen with understanding, you really want to understand everything you can about this life partner that you have. I think it takes a certain amount of curiosity. Now, one of the ways this ties into, I think it's the first chapter that Gottman talks about, he calls it love maps. And so he found one of the principles that he finds in successful couples is that you're really aware of your partner's world. And I've always been aware of Lindy's world. And I would guess that you're pretty aware of Curtis's world. And so it's surprising to me when couples come in and they really don't know that much about the other person. And often they don't know that much about what goes on in the other person's day, either at work or at home. And so there's this chapter he talks about love maps, which is just how well do you know who are your partner's best friends? What are their challenges at work? Just as simple as what do they like to do? What hobbies do they have? Sometimes partners don't know those simple things.
That baffles me.
It does me too, but I hear it. And I can't say, what are you talking about? You don't know, these simple things. So I just start talking about Gottman and how this is a characteristic of a successful marriage. But I think at the heart of it, it really comes down to, I am curious about your world and I want to know more about you.
Right. And I know almost everything that goes on in Curtis's work. Part of it is he works from home. And so when there's a problem, there's a problem that he needs to vent about, he comes to me and he just wants to tell me about it when he's frustrated about something. And he knows that a lot of what he says is work jargon and it goes right over the top of my head. But I listen anyways, and I try to understand, or I try to comprehend it in some way that I can at least be empathetic. And he really appreciates that. I can tell that he does because, well, he keeps coming back to me because I genuinely listen to him, because he's genuinely struggling with something. And I have no idea how to solve the problem, but I'm listening and I'm saying, man, that really sucks. I'm sorry your day is so rough.
So that goes back to the empathy, see, so the way you're doing it increases the likelihood that he will come to you in the future and do the same thing about whatever it is. It doesn't necessarily have to be work, and so it's not about solving the other person's problem. It's about listening and understanding. And the other thing I probably mentioned before is that, let's say you have these two people and they're married and one is listening to the other person. I would never enter into the other person's process unless invited. And what I mean by that is I would not offer a solution unless the other person invited me to do so.
That's a good point, and a really hard one. So I'm thinking about the video that you've referenced. It's not about the nail.
It's not about the nail, right?
Yes, that video. And so often we just want to fix the problem. And I have a really close friend who I talk with still regularly, and we live in different states now, but we would get together once a week, let our kids entertain each other, and we would just chat. And we would tell each other about problems we're having. And both of us would often try to go to solve it. And we've both gotten better about just listening and empathizing, but it's so hard to watch someone who you love and care about struggle and not try to fix it because you want them to be happier because you care about this person. But a lot of times they just need you to listen. They don't need a solution. They just need compassion.
Right. And I agree with you. It's hard to see people we love struggling. But I think first and foremost, it's about the listening and understanding. And then I think if a couple does that well, they eventually then get to solution. And I think what happens if the person feels like the person listening really gets it, I think they're more likely to say, what do you think I ought to do about this? Because they feel heard, they feel understood, they feel seen, and then they can, listen to any type of ideas. So I never enter into the other person's process unless invited to offer some sort of solution. So the last one I have listed, let me see if I can explain this. I was struggling to come up with words for this.
Okay.
I sometimes find, well, actually, this happens often. You'll get one partner or even both partners in a couple where they each think they're always right.
Oh, that would be frustrating.
Have you ever run into people who think they're always right?
I don't know. I mean, maybe, but it's hard to say.
See, the problem with that, well, there are a lot of problems with that, actually.
It's very egotistical.
Right. But the problem with it, too, here's some of the problems, is that it makes it very hard to listen with compassion and empathy without offering to solve the problem. Because often the person who thinks they're right is the first one is going to say, well, you ought to do this and this and this and this.
Yeah.
But the other thing with thinking that you're right is, I think in couples issues, it's often about compromise. So you're going to come in, you're two different people, you're trying to come up with a solution to a problem. And often, not always, but often there's going to be a compromise in there. If you think you're always right, you're going to be unwilling to compromise. And so I see that often. I see couples who come in just really for that particular issue. And here's one I hear, and I'm trying to think, I think I mostly hear this from men.
Okay.
A statement. And they'll say, well, it's just common sense. Whatever it is they're talking about, to them, it's just common sense. Which the underlying message to their spouse is what? You don't have any common
or that,
sense.
Yeah. Yeah, that's not very healthy.
No, No, it's not. It's the other person doesn't take it very well. So I think if you ever hear the words, well, it's just common sense, you really know you have someone who thinks they're right.
Uh-huh.
And I think also they're referring back to whatever experience they had in their families of origin growing
Right.
up. That's
Yeah,
where it
that
comes
was,
from.
yep. Yep. That's how I did it growing up. So, and it worked. So why wouldn't we do it this way now?
Right. And so
Because it doesn't work anymore.
they put that term in. It's just common sense. What are you talking about? Why would you do it any
Uh-huh.
other way?
Uh-huh.
So trying to help couples really understand they're not always right.
Mm-hmm.
And that I think, here's the important point. I think in most cases with couples issues, I don't know if there's a right or a wrong.
Yeah.
I think there's this huge gray area. Now, it's clear that in life there are some things that are right and wrong. I'm not saying that everything is that way, but I think the vast majority of issues that couple encounters, there's no right and wrong. Where I find this is in parenting. I'll talk to couples often about parenting.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in our episode on parenting, I mentioned this, that it's not that there is a right or a wrong way. It's your way as a couple. And the important thing is you come up with whatever your way is.
Yes.
But if you get in your corner and say, nope, this is the right way to do this, then there's going to be a lot more conflict in the relationship than is necessary. So that I think is an important one. Stay away from the belief that you are always right.
Or it's my way or the highway.
My way or the highway. Yeah.
That's not going to work very well.
Nope, it's not.
So I once heard a quote that said, men get married thinking the woman will never change, and women marry a man thinking they can change him. And so what happens
I think that's true.
Yes.
And I think that's true.
Often, yes. Often I think that's what happens. And the woman eventually changes and the man never does. So they both end up really unhappy. So it is very important to just accept your spouse for who they are early on. I would say one of the biggest conflicts in the first year of mine and Curtis's marriage was managing expectations. So he is a gamer. And he doesn't play video games as much as he used to. But when we first got married, he played a lot of video games. And I would get really mad at him for it because I'm like, why don't you come spend time with me? And he would say, well, just tell me you want to spend time. You want me to spend time with you. Just say something and I'll get off and we'll do something. And I'm like, no, I want you to want to get off and spend time with me. And it was really unfair of him. And so finally, I just had to accept he likes to play video games. It's who he is. I love him. I love him for who he is. And it has driven his love of technology, which has driven his field. And I just accepted it. And I started saying, hey, I want to do something with you. Can we do something together? That was all it took.
Good.
Yes. And it's worked really.
That's what you need to do.
Exactly. And it's worked really well throughout our entire marriage. Of course, we have 3 kids now. So his ability to game has really decreased. He doesn't have nearly as much time as he used to. But even when he does have free time, there's times where I'm like, hey, I wanted to hang out or I wanted to do something tonight. And of course, we've been married for 10 years. So now I know to say, hey, I want to do this tonight. So he doesn't start something. But, even when he does, it's like, can you spend time with me? I want your attention. I can even say it like that. And he says, okay, yeah, let me finish what I'm doing. And that's the end of it.
So, it's a really good point about expectations that I think a vast majority of couples issues are about unfulfilled expectations.
Yeah.
And so you each will have different expectations. That goes back to the idea that you're 2 different people. But the only way to solve that particular problem, since we don't read minds very well, is to put the expectation out on the table. And you talk about it. And so his expectation might be like, that he plays games once in a while. Your expectation is that he spends some time with you. And so there's some middle ground somewhere. And how do you get there? And so you have solved that by saying, hey, I want to spend time with you tonight. And it takes care of the problem. But you took that expectation and you verbalized it. You put it out there instead of being angry when the expectation wasn't fulfilled.
Right. And it didn't work really well. And it caused a lot of conflict early on. And we finally figured it out. But that's one of my talking points is own your
Yes.
expectations,
Oh, yeah.
acknowledge them. And I think that is from John Gottman. I had
Uh-huh.
a I had a friend who got married around the same time I did. And I'm pretty sure she read that book and she talked a lot about it. And one of the things was own your expectations and you have to tell them
Hmm.
what you expect because it's not fair to get mad because they didn't read your mind.
Right. And also, something you said triggered a thought. And that is, I think you said, I want you to want to spend time with me.
Yes.
So
Yes.
I hear that a lot. It's not that he doesn't want to spend time with you, it's that he has this other interest as well.
Mm-hmm.
Every day we're making choices about how we spend our time. And sometimes it's based on a request. I would like to spend time with you. Okay, I'll spend time with you. That's the way a healthy marriage works.
Yeah.
And then he can go off and play his game when
Mm-hmm.
he needs to. So yeah, I think, own your expectation, but also verbalize them and put them out on the table and talk about how you can each have some of your expectations met.
Right. So another topic that would be good to discuss is prioritizing your spouse even when you have kids.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this common acknowledgement that I don't even think you have to verbalize that once you have a kid, that little succubus is going to take everything. and and they really are. I mean, I love my three little succubuses, but succubi, I don't know what the right word for that is. But anyways, it's just understood that their needs are going to come before your own personal needs. But it
Right.
is still so important to prioritize your spouse anytime you can. Because what happens, and this happened with my parents, and I think it's more common with women, they put everything into their kids and they put so much into their kids and it ends up being their whole identity. And I remember my mom going through a bit of an identity crisis when my youngest brother was about the age of 12. And she's like, well, what do I do now? Who am I now? My kids are all grown or my kids are all independent. Now, who am I?
Yeah. And I think that we do not, well, I think we understand we don't accept easily the role of tens of thousands of years of evolution. And so when you think about, you said mothers often give everything. In order to ensure the survival of the species, that had to happen. So if
Yeah.
you think about 10,000 years ago on the savannas, the mothers had to make sure that was their job
Mm-hmm.
was to keep the child alive. And so, as each successive generation inherits those qualities. And so it makes sense to me
Yeah.
that mothers really dive into that because that's our history. That's how we survive. But I
And
agree
kids are
that,
just really demanding. I
well,
mean,
and so if I have a young couple, and I often see young couples who are having their first child, here's another book that John Gottman wrote. It's called And Baby Makes Three. And
mhm.
this was the whole purpose was to help couples through that first child because he found out, people call it the 7-year itch. Have you ever heard the 7-year itch? And
Yes.
so a lot of divorces, I think statistically around 6 or 7 years. And a lot of people, they were trying to figure out, well, why does that happen? And
Mhm.
what Gottman found out is that it also corresponds to typically the birth of the first child.
Okay.
And so that becomes a stressful time. So if I'm seeing a couple who's having their first child, I try and help them see, I think that first year is very,
Mhm.
very tough. And maybe I'm just keying off of my own experience, but I think the first year of all four of my children, it's tough because the child is, you're in diapers, they don't sleep well
Yeah.
typically.
Mhm.
Often the mother's nursing. I mean, there are all these things that are going on that you're tired. And maybe that's it in the first year. You're both really tired.
Yeah, and it can be really hard for first-time mothers because that baby takes everything.
Everything. Everything. Yeah.
Your sleep, your
Yeah.
sanity, your emotional
Yep.
and mental health,
Right.
and it can be really draining. And so mothers, like you said, we're programmed to just put everything into our child. But if you neglect your marital relationship, it will suffer because eventually the kids are going to move out and it's just going to be the two of you. And
Right.
if you haven't properly invested into your marriage, there's not going to be much of a marriage left if you
But
put
I also
everything
think,
into your kids.
yeah, I agree. I think it's also important, though, for the husband, in this case, to really have a lot of understanding
Yes.
that you are not going to be the priority for a while
Mhm.
because the survival of this little child depends on this. But getting
Yeah.
back to what you said is don't stop dating or don't stop prioritize your spouse at times. And so I think it just takes extra focus and extra work in that first year to really make an effort. And it's not going to be a big thing. It's not like you can go on a trip or typically and go out much unless you have someone you really trust with the child. You know, often we don't. But it's making an effort to show each other that you're still important.
Yes.
Now that's going to be different for every couple. And I don't even know that you need to leave the house. I mean, anything that COVID has done is in this quarantine time, hopefully it's taught us to be a little bit, more creative in the things that we might do because a lot of people were stuck at home. I know my son and his girlfriend in the Netherlands, they got really creative because they were pretty much stuck in their apartment. They had curfews and so there are things you can do. It just takes more effort.
Right. And I've even said, hey, let's do a date night tonight after the kids go to bed. And so what happens is one of us might go to the store and pick up some snacks, and then we'll sit down and we'll watch a movie or we'll play a game together. We're doing something and the kids are gone and we're really invested in each other. And it's really rough for, I would say, almost the first 2, maybe even 3 years, at least for our last 2 kids, it was because we felt like we could never go out by ourselves. It was so hard to get out just the 2 of us because our kids are just so attached. I thought it would be really great living with my mother-in-law in that, our kids are going to be so familiar and my 1-year-old is going to love them so much that we're going to be able to go out on dates because, my 1-year-old will be comfortable being with my mother-in-law, and that didn't happen.
It didn't happen. Well, I'm sorry that didn't happen.
I mean, it just was what it was. And part of it is she's physically unable to lift him. And so she didn't have a whole lot of opportunity to hold him. And, that just is what it is. I mean, there was nothing to be done about it. And we're getting there, but there are certainly ways that you can still show your spouse love. There's this cute, tiny little thing that we love that's taking everything from us, but you're still important to me.
Yeah. Yeah. Trying new things together.
Yes.
I think is really important. Our brain loves novelty. And I think one of the best things couples can do is try new things. And I hear couples, maybe they'll go to a new restaurant. Maybe they'll, try a new canyon to hike in. And it doesn't have to be anything extravagant. It's just you're doing something new with each other. And that is really, I think, important to keep kind of that spark alive. It creates a little bit of passion. Then the other thing, the importance of forgiveness.
Yes.
So the human condition, I think, is that we all make mistakes.
Yep.
And we all make mistakes in marriages, even marriages that are really, really good. We make mistakes. And so I think if we go back to some of those first things that I mentioned, compassion, empathy, listening, being non-judgmental, and the belief that, your way is not often the right way, I think it's really easier to listen to the other person if they've done something that's been, say, harmful or hurtful in the relationship. And so forgiveness, I believe, is like a social contract.
Okay.
Meaning you each play a part. And I think, for my part, if I've done something, I would come to you and I'd say, I am really sorry that I did this. And here's what I did. And, I'm going to really try not to do this thing again. The other person, then, their part of the social contract is they can actually accept that or reject it. And so I think, that is a choice. But I think to heal, forgiveness is really an important concept, that the belief that we all make mistakes and that we can try better and that we can repair from those mistakes. I'm a really big believer in repair. And that's actually one of the points that somewhere in Gottman's book, 7 Principles, he's going to talk about repair, that successful couples, it's not that they don't have any less conflict, it's that they repair really well.
Yes. And when they say, I forgive you, they actually mean it.
It's genuine.
It's genuine. And how many times do we hear this? Oh, every time we get into an argument, you bring this back up. That's really dangerous. And it's really easy to do.
It is.
But I mean, you said you forgave them. So it mitigates trust.
And so if you really forgive a person, then, you put it out of your mind. It's not necessarily that you forget about it, but you don't bring it up and you don't beat them over the head with it in the future.
It is not a weapon.
You really let it go. And so forgiveness, there's a great book, Janis Abrahms Spring is the author. It's called How Can I Forgive You? And it's talking about how can I forgive you, I think in the context of an affair. Okay. But she talks about forgiveness in a couple of different ways. I think she thinks there are 4 types of forgiveness. One is she calls it, I don't think she uses the word fake, but insincere forgiveness. Because I'm sure you've probably experienced someone, I do something terrible and the other person says, well, I forgive you. There's really no process that has occurred that would allow the person to forgive you. One is a sincere forgiveness, which we just talked about, which I think is that social contract. And the third one is you can actually choose not to forgive. No, I'm not going to forgive you. Now, I think that's damaging to the relationship. I'm not advising that. She just is outlining these 3 different types. And then the 4th type, she terms it as acceptance. That sometimes if the other person is not going to fulfill their part of that social contract, like maybe they've done something that to offend you or to hurt you, and they don't come to you and say, I did this thing. They didn't start the process. All you're really left with is acceptance.
Right.
That this is what happened.
Right. And so one thing too, to kind of maybe turn this on its side, is to keep in mind that generally your spouse, they aren't trying to hurt you. And so I think it's important to keep that in mind. There's been many times, in fact, where I said to Curtis, you did this or you said this, and I know you didn't mean it that way, but this is how it made me feel. This is how I felt about it. Right. And he acknowledges it, and he says, okay. And, he then knows to avoid that behavior. But I think we have to remember that, your spouse married you because they love you, and it's not their intention to hurt you. And rather than just blowing up, talk about it.
Right. So forgiveness, very important concept in successful marriages, and the ability to repair.
Yes. So don't stop dating. I would often say when I'm going on a date with my husband, he's no longer my husband, he's my boyfriend. I only date my boyfriend, because think about how thrilling and fun it is when you first start dating. Yeah. And, just that thrill of what's going to happen. And I mean, it's never actually really worked. I mean, it's never brought back that dating spark, but it's still kind of fun to just pretend like it's new and exciting, and it creates a fun dynamic. In fact, I've done that on Facebook before. I posted on a date with my boyfriend, and someone's like, aren't you married? And I'm like, yeah,
still on a date with my boyfriend.
Yeah, I am. I'm married to my boyfriend. All right. So next week, we are going to talk about kind of the opposite of this, repairing a damaged relationship.
Good topic also to talk about.
Yes. So we'll get into that next week, and we look forward to that. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.